Chapter 11 of Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C. M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The doctor said with weak belligerence, "Who do you think I am, Jones? I had to leave your friends behind. I had enough trouble getting those hoods to let me take you along. After all, I'm not a miracle worker." Ross said sullenly, Okay. He glowered out of the car window and spat out a tendril of red hair that had come loose from the fringe surrounding his mouth. The trouble with a false beard was that it itched, worse than the real article, worse than any torment Ross had ever known. But at least Ross, externally and at extreme range, was enough of a Jones to pass a casual glance. And what would Helena and Bernie be thinking now? He hadn't had a chance to whisper to them. They'd been just waking when the doctor dragged him out. Ross put that problem out of his mind. There were problems enough right on hand. He cautiously felt his red wig to see if it was on straight. The doctor didn't seem to look away from his driving, but he said, "Leave it alone. That's the first thing the PPs look for. Somebody who obviously isn't sure if his hair is still on or not. It won't come off." "Ugh," said Ross. The road was getting worse, it seemed. They had passed no houses for several miles now. They rounded a rutted turn, and ahead was a sign, "Stop. Restricted area ahead. Warning, this road is mined. No traffic allowed. Detour. Trespassers beyond this point will be shot without further notice. Decree number 404-5, People's Commissariat of Culture and Solidarity." The doctor spat contemptuously out the window and roared past. Ross said, "Hey." "Oh, relax," said the doctor. "That's just the cultureniks. Nobody pays any attention to them." Ross swallowed and sat as lightly as possible on the green leather cushion of the car. By the time they had gone a quarter of a mile, he began to feel a little reassured that the doctor knew what he was talking about. Then the doctor swerved sharply to miss a rusted hulk and almost skidded off the road. He swore and manhandled the wheel until they were back on the straightaway. White-lipped, Ross asked, "What was that?" "Car," grunted the doctor. "Hit a mine, silly fools." Ross squawked, "But you said—" "Shut up," the doctor ordered tensely. "That was weeks ago. They haven't had a chance to lay new mines since then." Pause. "I hope." The car roared on. Ross closed his eyes, limply abandoning himself to what was in store. But if it was bad to see what was going on, the roaring, swerving, jolting race was 10 times worse with his eyes closed. He opened them again in time to see another sign flash past, gone before he could read it. "What was that?" he demanded. "What's the difference?" the doctor grunted. "Want to go back?" "Well, no." Ross thought a moment. "Do we have to go this fast, though?" "If you want to get there. Crossed a PP's radar screen 10 miles back. They'll be chasing us by now." "Oh, I see," Ross said weakly. "Look, Doc, tell me one thing. Why do they make this place so hard to get to?" "Taboo area," the doctor said shortly. "Not allowed." "Why not allowed?" "Because it's not allowed. Don't want people poking through the old records." "Why not just put the old records in a safe place or burn the damn things up?" "Because they didn't, that's why. Shut up. Expect me to tell you why the PPs do anything? They don't know themselves. It isn't Jonesly to destroy, I guess." Ross shut up. He leaned against the window, letting the air rush over his head. They were moving through the forest, purplish, squatty trees with long, rustling leaves. The sky overhead was crisp and cool looking. It was still early morning. Ross exhaled a long breath. Back on Halsey's planet, he would be getting up about now, rising out of a soft, warm bed, taking his leisurely time about breakfast, climbing into a comfortable car to make his way to the spaceport where he was safe, respected, and at home. Damn Harland. At least, Ross thought, some sort of pattern was beginning to shape up. The planets were going out of communication, each for its own reasons, but wasn't there a basic reason for the reasons that was the same in each case? Wasn't there some overall design, some explanation that covered all the facts, pointed to a way out? He sat straight up as they approached a string of little signs. He scanned them worriedly as they rolled past. Workers, peasants, Joneses all, buy these presents, know ye, if you don't stop in spite of all, this to hell will blow ye. Doc, the doctor yelled, crouching down in the seat and guiding the careening car with one hand. Ross, startled, followed his example, but not before he saw that this was an automatic, radar-actuated, rapid-fire gun mounted a few yards past the last sign. There was a stuttering roar from the gun and a splatter of metal against the armored sides of the car. The doctor sat up again as soon as the burst had hit. Evidently only one was to be feared. Yeah, he jeered at the absent builders of the gun. Lousy 50 millimeters can't punch their way through a tin can. Ross, gasping, got up just in time to see the last sign in the series. My Order of People's Democratic Council of Arts and Sciences, Small Arms Division. He said wildly, "They can't even write a poem properly. Did you notice the first and third line rhyme words?" Surprisingly, the doctor glanced at him and laughed with a note of respect. He took a hand off the wheel to pat Ross on the shoulder. "You'll make a Jones yet, my boy," he promised. "Don't worry about these things. I told you this place was restricted. This stuff isn't worth bothering about." Ross found that he was able to smile. There was a point, he realized, with astonishment, where courage came easily. It was the only thing left. He sat up straighter and breathed the air more deeply. Then it happened. They rounded another curve. The doctor slammed on the brakes. Suspended overhead, across the road, was a single big sign. "That's all, Jones. People's Police." The car bucked, slewed around, and skidded, the wheels locked, but not in time to keep it from sliding into the pit, road wide and 4 feet deep, that was dug in front of them. Ross heard the axles crack and the tires blow, but the springing of the car was equal to the challenge. He was jarred clear in the air and tumbled to the floor in a heap, but no bones were broken. Painfully, he pushed the door open and crawled out. The doctor limped after him, and the two of them stood on the edge of the pit, looking at the ruin of their car. "That one," said the doctor, "was worth bothering about." He motioned Ross to silence and cocked an ear. Was there a distant roaring sound, like another car following on the road they had traveled? Ross wasn't sure, but the doctor's expression convinced him. "Peace," he said briefly. "From here on, it's on foot. They won't follow beyond here, but let's get out of sight. They'll by Jones shoot beyond here if they see us." Ross stared unbelievingly. "This is Earth?" he asked. The doctor fanned himself and blew. "That's it," he said, looking around curiously. "Heard a lot about it, but I've never been here before," he explained. "Funny looking, isn't it?" He nudged Ross, indicating a shattered concrete structure beside them on the road. "Notice that toll booth?" he whispered slyly. 8 sides. Ross said wearily, "Yes, mighty funny. Look, Doc, why don't you sort of wander around by yourself for a while? The big thing up ahead is the museum you were talking about, isn't it?" The doctor squinted. His eyes were unnaturally bright, and his breathing was fast, but he was making an attempt to seem casual in the presence of these manifold obscenities of design. He licked his lips. "Round pillars," he marveled. "Why, yes, I think that's the museum. You go on up there like you say. I'll, sort of see what there is to see. Jones, yes." He staggered off, staring from ribald curbing to scatological wall in an orgy of prurience. Ross sighed and walked through the deserted, weed-grown streets to the stone building that bore on its cracked lintel the one surviving word, Earth. This was all wrong, he was almost certain. Earth had to be a planet, not a city, but still. The museum had to have the answers. On its moldering double doors was a large lead seal. He read, "Surplus Information Repository. Access denied to unauthorized personnel." But the seal had been forced by somebody. One of the doors swung free, creaking. Ross invoked the forcer of the door. If he could do it. He went in and stumbled over a skeleton, presumably that of the last entrant. The skull had been crushed by a falling beam. There was some sort of mechanism involved. A trigger, a spring, a released hook. All had rusted badly, and the spring had lost its tension over the years. A century? 2? 5? Ross prayed that any similar man-traps had likewise rusted solid, and cautiously inched through the dismal hall of the place, ready for a backward leap at the first whisper of a concealed mechanism in action. It was unnecessary. The place was dead. Exploring room after room, he realized slowly that he was stripping off history in successive layers. The first had been the booby-trapped road, lackadaisically planned to ensure that mere inquisitiveness would be discouraged. There had been no real denial of access, for there was almost no possibility that anybody would care to visit the place. Next, the seal and the man-traps. An earlier period. Someone had once said, "This episode is closed. This history is determined. We have all reached agreement. Only a dangerous and frivolous meddler would seek to rake over these dead ashes." And then, prying into the museum, Ross found the era during which agreement had been reached, during which it still was necessary to insist and demonstrate and cajole. The outer rooms and open shelves were testimonials to Jones. There were books of Jonesology, ingenious, persuasive books divided usually into 3 sections. Human Jonesology would be a painstaking effort to determine the exact physical and mental tolerances of a Jones. Anatomical atlases minutely gave femur lengths, cranial angles, eye colors to an angstrom, hair thickness to a micron. Moral Jonesology treated of the dangers of deviating from these physical and more elastic mental specifications. Here the formula appeared again, repeatedly invoked but never explained. Already it was a truism. And Sacred Jonesology was a series of assertions concerning the nature of the Jones in whose image all other Joneses were created. Subdivisions of the open shelves held works on geographical Jonesology, the distribution across the planet of Joneses, and similar works. Ross was looking for a lower layer of history and found it in a bale of crumbling pamphlets. "Comrades, we must now proceed to consolidate our victory." "Ultra-Jonesism, an infantile political disorder." "On the fallacy of Jonesism in one country." These Ross devoured. They added up to the tale of a savage political battle among the victors of a greater war. Clemency was advocated and condemned. Extermination of the opposition was casually mentioned. The cultural faction and the biological faction had obviously been long locked in a death struggle. Across the face of each pamphlet stood a similar logotype, the formula. It was enigmatically mentioned in one pamphlet, which almost incomprehensibly advanced the claims of the biological faction to supremacy among the Joneses United. Let us never forget, comrades, that the initiation of the great struggle was not caused by our will, or by the will of our sincere and valiant opponents, the culturalists. The inexorable law of nature, L sub t equals L sub 0 e to the minus t over 2n, was the begetter of that Holocaust from which our planet has emerged purified. Was it now? The entrance to a musty, airless wing had once been bricked up. The mortar was crumbling, and a few bricks had fallen. Above the arched doorway a sign said, Military Archives. On the floor was a fallen metal plaque whose inscription said simply, Dead Storage. He kicked the loose bricks down and stepped through. That was it. The place was lightless except for the daylight filtering through the violated archway. Ross hauled maps and orders and period newspapers and military histories and handbooks into the corridor in armfuls and spread them on the floor. It only took minutes for him to realize that he had his answer. He ran into the street and shouted for the doctor. Together they pored over the papers, occasionally reading aloud choice bits wonderingly. The simplest statement of the problem they found was in the paper-backed Why We Fight pamphlet issued for the enlisted men of the Provisional North Continent Government Army. What is a Jones? The pamphlet asked rhetorically. A Jones is just a human being the same as you and I. Dismiss rumors that a Jones is supernatural or unkillable with a laugh when you hear them. They arose because of the extraordinary resemblance of one Jones to another. Putting a bullet through one Jones in a skirmish and seeing another one rise up and come at you with a bayonet is a chilling experience. In the confusion of battle, it may seem that the dead Jones rose and attacked. But this is not the case. Never let the rumor pass unchallenged, and never fail to report habitual rumor mongers. How did the Joneses get that way? Many of you were too young when this long war began to be aware of the facts. Since then, wartime disruption of education and normal communication facilities has left you in the dark. This is the authoritative statement in simple language that explains why we fight. This planet was colonized, presumably from the quasi-legendary planet Earth. The famous Earth Archives building, incidentally, is supposed to derive its puzzling name from this fact. It is presumed that the number of colonists was originally small, probably in the hundreds. Though the number of human beings on the planet increased enormously as the generations passed, genetically the population remained small. The same one's heredity units were combined and reshuffled in varying combinations, but no new ones were added. Now, it is a law of genetics that in small populations, variations tend to smooth out and every member of the population tends to become like every other member. So-called unfixed genes are lost as the generations pass. The end product of this process would theoretically be a population in which every member had exactly the same genes as every other member. This is a practical impossibility, but the Joneses whom we fight are a tragic demonstration of the fact that the process need not be pushed to its ultimate extreme to dislocate the life of a planet and cause endless misery to its dwellers. From our very earliest records, there have been Joneses. It is theorized that this gangling, red-headed type was well represented aboard the original colonizing ship, but some experts believe one Jones type and the workings of chance would be sufficient to produce the unhappy situation of type dominance. Some 25 years ago, Joneses were everywhere among us, and not, as now, withdrawn to southern continent and organized into a ruthless aggressor nation. They made up about 30% of the population and had become a closely knit organization devoted to mutual help. They held the balance of political power in every election from the municipal to the planetary level, and virtually monopolized production and finance. There were fanatics and rabble-rousers among them who readily exploited a rising tide of discontent over a series of curbing laws, finally pushed through by a planetary majority, united at last in self-defense against the rapacity and ruthless self-interest of the Joneses. The Joneses withdrew en masse to southern continent. Some sincerely wished them well. Others scoffed at the secession as a sulky and childish gesture. Only a handful of citizens guessed the terrible truth and were laughed at for their pains. 5 years after their withdrawal, the Joneses returned across the Vandermeer Peninsula, and the war had begun. A final word. There has been much loose talk among the troops about the slogan of the Joneses, which goes, L sub T equals L sub 0 e to the minus T over 2n. Some uninformed people actually believe it is an invocation which gives the Joneses supernatural power and invulnerability. It is not. It is merely an ancient and well-known formula in genetics, which quantitatively describes the loss of unfixed genes from a population. By mouthing this formula, the Joneses are simply expressing in a compact way their ruthless determination that all genes except theirs shall disappear from the planet, and the Joneses alone survive. In the formula, L sub T means the number of genes after the lapse of T years. L sub 0 means the original number of genes. E means the base of the natural system of logarithms, and N means number of generations. The surgeon said slowly and with wonder, "So that was my God." He stretched out his hands before him. The fingers were rock steady. Ross left him and paced the corridor uneasily. Fine. Now he knew. Lost genes in genetically small populations. On Halsey's planet, some fertility gene, no doubt. On Azor, a male sex-linked gene that provides men with the backbone required to come out ahead in the incessant war of the genders. Bernie was a gutless character. Here, all too many genes determining somatotype. On the planets that had dropped out of communication, who knew? Scientific thought genes, sex drive determining genes. One thing was clear. Any gene loss was bad for the survival of a planetary colony. Evolution had, on Earth, worked out in 1 billion trial and error years a working mechanism, man. Man exhibited a vast range of variation, which was why he survived almost any conceivable catastrophe. Reduce man to a single type, and he is certain to succumb sooner or later to the inevitable disaster that his one type cannot cope with. The problem, now stated clearly, was bigger than he had dreamed, and now he knew only the problem, not the solution. Go to Earth. Well, he had tried. There had been no flaw in his calculations, no failure in setting up the Wesley panel. Yet, this was Jones, not Earth. The city was only a city, not the planet that the star charts logged. And the planet, beyond all other considerations, was less like Earth than any conceivable chart error could account for. Gravitation, wrong. Atmosphere, wrong. Flora and fauna, wrong. So, eliminate the impossible, and what remains, however unlikely, is true. So there had been a flaw in his calculations. And the way to check that, once and for all, was to get back to the starship. Ross wheeled and went back into the book room. "Doc," he called out, "how do we get out of here?" The answer was on their bellies. They trudged through the forest for hours, skirting the road, hiding whenever a suspicious noise gave warning that someone might be in the vicinity. The Peepees knew they were in the woods, there was no doubt of that, and as soon as they got past the taboo area, they had to crawl. It was well past dark before Ross and the doctor, scratched and aching, got to the tiny hamlet of Jonesy-on-the-Pike. By the light from the one window in the village that gave any signs of life, the doctor took a single horrified look at Ross and shuddered. "Oh, you wait here," he ordered. "Hide under a bush or something, your beard rubbed off." Ross watched the doctor rap on the door and be admitted. He couldn't hear the conversation that followed, but he saw the doctor's hand go to his pocket, then clasp the hand of the figure in the doorway. That was the language all the galaxy understood, Ross realized. He only hoped that the householder was an honest man, that is, one who would stay bribed, instead of informing the Peepees on them. It was beyond doubt that their descriptions had long since been broadcast. The road must have been lined with TV scanners on the way in. The door opened again, and the doctor walked briskly out. He strode out into the street, walked half a dozen paces down the road, and waited for Ross to catch up with him. "Okay," the doctor whispered. "They'll pick us up in half an hour, down the road about a quarter of a mile. Let's go." "What about the man you were talking to?" Ross asked. "Won't he turn us in?" The doctor chuckled. "I gave him a drink of Jones's juice out of my private stock," he said. "No, he won't turn anybody in, at least not until he wakes up." Ross nodded invisibly in the dark. He had a thought and suppressed it, but it wouldn't stay down. Cautiously, he let it seep through his subconscious again and looked it over from every angle. No, there wasn't any doubt of it. Things were definitely looking up. Ben Jones roared. "Just what the hell do you think you're doing, Doc?" The doctor pushed Ross through the doorway and turned to face the other Jones. He said mildly, "What?" "You heard me," Ben Jones blustered. "I let you out with this one, and maybe I made a mistake at that. But I, by Jones, don't intend to let you get out of here with all three of them. What are you trying to get away with, anyhow?" The doctor didn't change his mild expression. He took a short, unhurried step forward. Smack! Ben Jones reeled back from the slap, his mouth open, hand to his face. "Hey!" he squawked. The doctor said levelly, "I'm telling you this just one time, Ben. Don't cross me. You've got the guns, but I've got these." He held up his spread hands. "You can shoot me, I won't deny that. But you can't make me do your dirty work for you. From now on, things go my way. With these three people, with my own life, with the bootleg plastic surgery we do to keep you in armored cars, or else there won't be any plastic surgery." Ben Jones swallowed, and Ross could see the man fighting himself. He said after a moment, "No reason to act sore, Doc. Haven't we always got along? The only thing is, maybe you don't realize how dangerous these three—" "Shut up," said the doctor. "Right, boys?" The other two Joneses in the room shuffled and looked uncomfortable. One of them said, "Don't get mad, Ben, but it kind of looks as if he's right. We and the doc had a little talk before you got here. It figures, you have to admit it. He does the work. We ought to let him have something to say about it." The look that Ben Jones gave him was pure poison, but the man stood up to it, and in a minute Ben Jones looked away. "Sure," he said distantly. "You go right ahead, Doc. We'll talk this over again later on, when we've all had a chance to cool off." The doctor nodded coldly and followed Ross out. Helena and Bernie, suitably Jonesified for the occasion, were already in the car. Ross and the doctor jumped in with them and they drove away. Now that the strain was relaxed a bit, the doctor was panting, but there was a grin on his lips. "Son of a Jones," he said happily. "I've been waiting 5 years for this day." Ross asked, "Is it all right? They won't chase after us?" "No, not Ben Jones. He has his own way of handling things. Now, if we were stupid enough to go back there after he had a chance to talk to the others without me around, that would be something different. But we aren't going back." Ross's eyes widened. "Not even you, Doc?" "Especially not me." The doctor concentrated on his driving. Presently, "If I take you to the rendezvous, can you find your ship from there?" he asked. "Sure," said Ross confidently. "And Doc, welcome to our party." Space had never looked better. They hung 500,000 miles off Jones, and Ross fumbled irritably with the Wesley panel, while the other three stood around and made helpful suggestions. He set up the integrals for Earth just as he had set them up once before. The plot came out the same. He transferred the computations to the controls and checked it against the record in the log. The same. The ship should have gone straight as a 5-dimensional geodesic arrow to the planet Earth. Instead, he found by cross-checking the star atlas, it had gone in almost the other direction entirely, to the planet of Jones. He threw his pencil across the room and swore. "I don't get it," he complained. "It's probably broken, Ross," Helena told him seriously. "You know how machines are. They're always doing something funny just when you least expect it." Ross bit down hard on his answer to that. Bernie contributed his morsel, and even Dr. Sam Jones, whose race had lost even the memory of spaceflight, had a suggestion. Ross swore at them all, then took time to swear at the board, at the starship, at Harland, at Wesley, and most of all, at himself. Helena turned her back pointedly. She said to Bernie, "The way Ross acts, sometimes you'd honestly think he was the only one who'd ever run this thing. Why, my goodness, I know you can't rely on that silly board. Didn't I have just exactly the same experience with it myself?" Ross gritted his teeth and doggedly started all over again with the computations for Earth. Then he did a slow double take. "Helena," he whispered, "what experience did you have?" "Why, just the same as now. Don't you remember, Ross? When you and Bernie were in jail and I had to come rescue you?" "What happened?" Ross shouted. "My goodness, Ross, don't yell at me. There was that silly light flashing all the time. It was driving me out of my mind. Well, I knew perfectly well that I wasn't going to get anywhere if it was going to act like that, so I just—" Ross, eyes glazed, robot-like, lifted the cover off the main Wesley unit. Down at the socket of the alarm signal, shorting out 2 delicately machined helices that were a basic part of the Wesley drive, wedged between an eccentric vernier screw and a curious crystalline lattice, was the hairpin. He picked it out and stared at it unbelievingly. He marveled. "It says in the manual, On no account should any alterations be made in any part of the Wesley driving assembly by any technician under a C-12 rating. She didn't like the alarm going off, so she fixed it with a hairpin. Helena giggled and appealed to Bernie. "Doesn't he kill you?" she asked. Ross's eyes were glazed, and his hands worked convulsively. "Kill," he muttered, advancing on Helena. "Kill, kill, kill." "Help!" she screamed. The two men managed to subdue Ross with the aid of a needle from Dr. Jones's kit pocket. Helena was in tears and tried to explain to the others. "Just for no reason at all." She only got icy stares. After a while, she sulkily began setting up the Wesley board for the Earth jump. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C. M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Ross awoke, clear-headed and alert. Helena and Bernie were looking at him apprehensively. He understood and said grudgingly, "Sorry I flipped. I didn't mean to scare you. Everything seemed to go black." They smothered him with relieved protestations that they understood perfectly, and Helena wouldn't stick hairpins into the Wesley Drive ever again. Even if the ship hadn't blown up, even if she had rescued the men from Minerva. "Anyway," she said happily, "we're off Earth. At least it's supposed to be Earth, according to the charts." He unkinked himself and studied the planet through a vision screen at its highest magnification. The apparent distance was 1 mile. Nothing was hidden from him. "Golly," he said, impressed. "Science makes you realize what backward gropers we were." Obviously, they had it down there on the pleasant, cloud-flecked green and blue planet. Science. White, towering cities whose spires were laced by flying bridges and inexplicably decorated with something that looked like cooling fins. Huge, super-streamlined vehicles lazily coursing the streets and skies. Long, linked pontoon cities slowly heaving on the breasts of the oceans. Science. Ross said reverently, "We're here. Flarney was right. Helena, Bernie, Doc, maybe this is the parent planet of us all, and maybe it isn't. But the people who built those cities must know all the answers. Helena, will you please land us?" "Sure, Ross. Shall I look for a spaceport?" Ross frowned. "Of course. Do you think these people are savages? We'll go in openly and take our problem to them. Besides, imagine the radar setup they must have. We'd never sneak through even if we wanted to." Helena casually fingered the controls. There was the sickening swoop characteristic of her ship handling, several times repeated. As she jerked them wildly across the planet's orbit, she explained over her shoulder, "I had the damnedest time finding a really big spaceport on that little radar thing. Oops! But there's a nice-looking one near that coastal city. Whee! That was close. There was one, sorry, Ross, on a big lake island, but I didn't like it. Now, everybody be very quiet. This is the hard part, and I have to concentrate." Ross hung on. Helena landed the ship with her usual timber-shivering crash. "Now," she said briskly, "we'd better allow a little time for it to cool down. This is nice, isn't it?" Ross dragged himself, bruised, from the floor. He had to agree. It was nice. The landing field, rimmed by gracious, light buildings with the cooling fins, was dotted with great silvery ships. They didn't, Ross thought with a twinge of irritation, seem to be space vessels, though. Leave it to Helena to get them down at some local airport. Still, the ships, also he noted, were liberally studded with the fins. He peered at them with puzzlement and a rising sense of excitement. Certainly they had a function, and that function could only be some sort of energy receptor. Could it be? Dared he imagine that it was the long-dreamed-of cosmic energy tap? What a bonus that would be to bring back with him. And what other marvels might this polished technology have to give them? Bernie distracted him. He said, "Hey, Ross, here comes somebody." "Hey, Ross, here comes somebody." But even Bernie's tone was awed. A magnificent vehicle was crawling toward them across the field. It was long, low, bullet-shaped, and with cooling fins. Multiple plates of silvery metal contrasted with a glossy black finish. All about its periphery was a lacy pattern of intricate crumples and crinkles of metal, as though its skirts had been crushed and rumpled. Ross sighed and marveled. What a production problem these people had solved, stamping those forms out between dies. Then he saw the faces of the passengers. He drew in his breath sharply. Godlike. Two men whose brows were cliffs of alabaster, whose chins were strong with the firmness of steady, flame-like wisdom. Two women whose calm, lovely features made the heart within him melt and course. The vehicle stopped 10 yards from the open space lock of the ship. From its tip gushed upward a 10-foot fountain of sparks that flashed the gamut of the rainbow. Simultaneously, one of the godlike passengers touched the wheel, and there was a sweet, piercing, imperative summons like 100 strings and brasses in unison. Helena whispered, "They want us to come out. Ross, I can't face them." She buried her face in her hands. "Steady," he said gravely. "They're only human." Ross gripped that belief tightly. He hardly dared permit himself to think, even for a second, that perhaps these people were no longer merely human. Hoarsely, he said, "We need their help. Maybe we should send Doc Jones out first. He's the oldest of us, and he's the only one you could call a scientist. He can talk to them. Where is he?" A raucous Jones voice bellowed through the domed control room. "Who wants old Doc, huh? Who wants good old Doc?" Good old Doc staggered into the room, obviously loaded to the gills by a very enjoyable backslide. He began to sing. "In AJ 732, a Jones from Jones Valley, he wandered into Jonestown to hold a Joneses rally. He shocked the gents and ladies both. His talk was most disturbing. He spoke of 7-sided doors and purple-colored curbing." Jones's eyes focused on Helena. He flushed. "Deeply sorry," he mumbled. "Unforgivable vulgarity. Momentarily forgot ladies were present." Again, that sweet summons sounded. "Pull yourself together, Doctor," Ross begged. "This is Earth. The people seem very advanced. Don't disgrace us, please." Jones's face went pale and perspiration broke out. "Excuse me," he mumbled and staggered out again. Ross closed the door on him and said, "We'll leave him. He'll be all right. Nothing's going to happen here." He took a deep breath. "We'll all go out," he said. Unconsciously, Ross and Helena drew closer together and joined hands. They walked together down the unfolding ramp and approached the vehicle. One of the coolly lovely women scrutinized them and turned to the man beside her. She remarked melodiously, "You say they be bims," and laughed a silvery tinkle. Panic gripped Ross for a long moment, a thing he had never considered, but a thing which he should have realized would be inevitable. Of course. These folks, older and incomparably more advanced than the rest of the peoples in the universe, would have evolved out of the common language into a speech of their own, deliberately or naturally rebuilt to handle the speed, subtlety, and power of their thoughts. But perhaps the older speech was merely disused and not lost. He said formally, quaking, "People of Earth, we are strangers from another sun. We throw ourselves on your mercy and ask for your generosity. Our problem is summed up in the genetic law, L sub T equals L sub 0 e to the minus T over 2n. Of course." One of the men was laughing. Ross broke off. The man smiled. "What's that again?" They understood. He repeated the formula slowly and would have explained further, but the man cut him off. "Math," the man smiled. "We don't use that stuff no more. I got a lab assistant. Maybe he uses it sometimes." They were beyond mathematics. They had broken through into some mode of symbolic reasoning that must be as far beyond mathematics as math was beyond primitive languages. "Sir," he said eagerly, "you must be a scientist. May I ask you to—" "Get in," he smiled. Gigantic doors unfolded from the vehicle. Thought reading? Had the problem been snatched from his brain even before he stated it? Mutely, he gestured at Helena and Bernie. Jones would be all right where he was for several hours if Ross was any judge of blackouts. And you don't quibble with demigods. The man, the scientist, did something to a glittering control panel that was literally more complex than the Wesley board back on the starship. Noise filled the vehicle. Noise that Ross identified as music for a moment. It was a starkly simple music whose skeleton was 3 thumps and a crash. 3 thumps and a crash. Then followed an antiphonal chant, a clear tenor demanding in a monotone, "Is this your car?" And a tremendous chorally shouted, "No!" Too deep for him, Ross thought forlornly as the car swerved around and sped off. His eyes wandered over the control board and fixed on the largest of its dials, where a needle crawled around from a large 40 to a large 50 and a red 60, proportional to the velocity of the vehicle. Unable to concentrate because of the puzzling music, unable to converse, he wondered what the units of time and space were that gave readings of 50 and 60 for their very low rate of speed, hardly more than a brisk walk when you noticed the slow passage of objects outside. But there seemed to be a whistle of wind that suggested high speed, perhaps an effect peculiar to the cooling fin power system, however it worked. He tried to shout a question at the driver, but it didn't get through. The driver smiled, patted his arm, and returned to his driving. They nosed past a building, cooling fins, and Ross almost screamed when he saw what was on the other side. a curve of highway jammed solid with vehicles that were traveling at blinding speed, and the driver wasn't stopping. Ross closed his eyes and jammed his feet against the floorboards, waiting for the crash, which somehow didn't come. When he opened his eyes, they were in the traffic, and the needle on the speedometer quivered at 275. He blew a great breath and thought admiringly. Reflexes to match their superb intellects, of course. There couldn't have been a crash. Just then, across the safety island in the opposing lane, there was a crash. The very brief flash of vision Ross was allowed told him, incredibly, that a vehicle had attempted to enter the lane going the wrong way, with the consequences you'd expect. He watched goggle-eyed as the effects of the crash rippled down the line of oncoming traffic. The squeal of brakes and rending of metal was audible even above the thumping music. "Is this your car?" "No." Thereafter, as they drove, the opposing lane was motionless but not silent. The piercing blasts of strings and trumpets rose to the heavens from each vehicle, as did the brilliant pyrotechnic jets. A call for help, Ross theorized. The music was beginning to make his head ache. It had been going on for at least 10 minutes. Suddenly, blessedly, it changed. There was a great fanfare of trombones in major thirds that seemed to go on forever, but didn't quite. At the end of forever, the same tenor chanted, "You got a Roadmeister?" And the chorus roared, "Yes!" Ross realized forlornly that the music must contain values and subtleties which his coarser senses and undeveloped aesthetic background could not grasp. But he wished it would stop. It was making him miss all the scenery. After perhaps the 15th repetition of the Roadmeister motif, it ended. The driver, with a look of deep satisfaction, did something to the control board that turned off a subsequent voice before it could get out more than a syllable. He turned to Ross and yelled above the suddenly noticeable rush of air, "Talk, talk, talk," and gave a whimsical shrug. During the moment his attention wandered from the road, his vehicle rammed the one ahead, decelerated sharply and was rammed by the one behind, accelerated and rammed the one ahead again, and then fell back into place. Ross suddenly realized that he knew what had caused those crumples and crinkles around the periphery of the car. "Subtle!" the driver yelled. "Indirection! Sneak it in!" "What?" Ross screamed. "The commersh!" the driver yelled. It meant nothing to Ross, and he felt miserable because it meant nothing. He studied the roadside unhappily and almost beamed when he saw a sign coming up. Not advertising, of course, he thought. Perhaps some austere reminder of a whole man's duty to the race and himself. Some noble phrase that summed up the wisdom of a great thinker. But the sign, and it had cooling fins, declared, "Be smug, smoke smogs." And the next one urged, "Beat your sister, cheat your brother, but send some smogs to dear old mother." It said it on 4 signs which, apparently alerted by radar, zinged in succession along a roadside track even with the vehicle. There were more, and worse. They were coming to a city. Turmoil and magnificence. White pylons, natty belts of green, lacy bridges, the roaring traffic, nimble skipping pedestrians waving at the cars and calling greetings. It sounded like "Savabib, Savabib, Baz, Baz." The shops were packed and radiant, dazzling. Ross wondered fleetingly how one parked here, and then found out. a car pulled from the curb, and 100 cars converged on the spot, shrilling their sweet message and spouting their gay sparkles. Theirs, too. There were a pair of jolting crashes as it shouldered two other vehicles aside and parked, two wheels over the curb and on the sidewalk. "Survive, boss!" shouted drivers, and the man beside Ross gaily repeated the cry. The vehicle's doors opened and they climbed out into the quick tempo of the street. It was loud with a melodious babble from speaker horns visible everywhere. The driver yelled cheerfully at Ross, "Come on, party!" He followed, dazed and baffled, assailed by sudden doubts and contradictions. It was a party, all right. 20 floors up a shimmering building in a large, handsome room whose principal decorative motif seemed to be cooling fins. Perhaps 20 couples were assembled. They turned and applauded as they made their appearance. The vehicle driver, standing grandly at the head of a short flight of stairs leading to the room, proclaimed, "I got these rocket flyers like on the piece of paper you guys read me. Right off the field, 20 points. How about that?" A tall, graying man with a noble profile hurried up and beamed. "Good show, Joe. I knew we could count on you to try for the high point combo. You always was a real sport. You got the fish?" "Sure we got the fish." Joe turned and said to one of the lovely ladies, "Elna, show him the fish." She unwrapped a 10-pound swordfish and proudly held it up while Ross, Bernie, and Helena stared wildly. The profile took the fish and poked it. "Real enough, Joe. You done great. Now if the rocket flyers here are okay, you're okay. Then you got 20 points and the prize. You're a rocket flyer, ain't you, Buster?" Ross realized he was being addressed. He croaked, "Men of Earth, we come from a far distant star in search of—" The profile said, "Just a minute, Buster, just a minute. You ain't from Earth?" "We come from a far distant star in search of—" "Stick to the point, Buster. You ain't a rocket flyer from Earth? None of you?" "No," Ross said. He furtively pinched himself. It hurt. Therefore he must be awake. Or crazy. The profile was sorrowfully addressing a downcast Joe. "You should have asked them, Joe. You really should have. Now you don't even get the 3 points for the swordfish, because you went and tried for the combo. Oh, it really is a pity. Didn't you ask them at all?" Joe blustered. "He did say something, but I figured a rocket flyer was a rocket flyer and they come out of a rocket." His lower lip was trembling. Both of the ladies of his party were crying openly. "We tried," Joe said and began to blubber. Ross moved away from him in horrified disgust. The profile shook its head, turned, and announced, "Owing to an unfortunate mistake, the search group of Dr. Joseph Mulcahy, SCD, PhD, got disqualified for the combination. They only got 3 points. So that's all the groups in, and who got the highest?" "I got 15, I got 15, screamed a gorgeous brunette in a transport of joy. "A manhole cover from the museum, and a last month Lip Reader's Digest, and a steering wheel from a police car. I got 15. The others clustered around her, chattering. Ross said to the profile mechanically, "Men of Earth, we come from a far distant star in search of—" "Sure, Buster," said the profile. "Sure, too bad, but you should have told Joe. You don't have to go. You and your friends have a drink, mix, have fun. I gotta go give the prize now." He hurried off. A passing blonde, stacked, said to Ross, "Hello, Baldy. Want to see my operation?" He began to shake his head, and felt Helena's fingers close like steel on his arm. The blonde sniffed and passed on. "I'll operate her," Helena said, and then, "Ross, what's wrong with everybody? They act so young, even the old people." "Follow me," he said, and began to circulate through the party, trailing Bernie and a frankly terrified Helena, buttonholing and confronting and demanding and cajoling. Nothing worked. He was greeted with amused tolerance and invited to have a drink and asked what he thought of the latest commercial with its tepid trumpets. Nobody gave a damn that he was from a far distant star except Joe, who sullenly watched them wander and finally swaggered up to Ross. "I figured something out," he said grimly. "You made me lose." He brought up a roundhouse right, and Ross saw the stars and heard the birdies. Bernie and Helena brought him to on the street. He found he had been walking for some 5 minutes with a blanked-out mind. They told him he had been saying over and over again, "Men of Earth, I come from a far distant star." It had got them ejected from the party. Helena was crying with anger and frustration. She also got a nasty scare when one of the vehicles had swerved up onto the sidewalk and almost crushed the three of them against the building wall. "And," she wailed, "I'm hungry, and we don't know where the ship is, and I've got to sit down and go someplace." "So do I," Bernie said weakly. So did Ross. He said, "Let's just go into this restaurant. I know we have no money. Don't nag me, please, Helena. We'll order, eat, not pay, and get arrested." He held up his hands at the protest. "I said get arrested. The smartest thing we could do. Obviously somebody's running this place, and it's not the Stoops we've seen. The quickest way I know of to get to whoever's in charge is to get in trouble. And once they see us, we can explain everything." It made sense to them. Unfortunately, the first restaurant they tried was coin-operated, from the front door on. So were the second to seventh. Ross tried to talk Bernie into slugging a pedestrian so they could all be jugged for disturbing the peace, but failed. Helena noted at last that the women's wear shops had live attendants who, presumably, would object to trouble. They marched into one of the gaudy places, each took a dress from a rack and methodically tore them to pieces. A saleslady approached them dithering and asked tremulously, "What for did you do that? Didn't you like the dresses?" "Well, yes, very much," Helena said apologetically. "But you see, the fact is—" "Shut up," Ross told her. He said to the saleslady, "No, we hated them. We hate every dress here. We're going to tear up every dress in the place. Why don't you call the police?" "Oh," she said vaguely. "All right," and vanished into the rear of the store. She returned after a minute and said, "He wants to know your names." "Just say 3 desperate strangers," Ross told her. "Oh, thank you." She vanished again. The police arrived in 5 minutes or so. An excited elder man with many stripes on his arms strode up to them excitedly as they stood among the shredded ruins of the dresses. "Where'd they go?" he demanded. "Did you see what they look like?" "We're them. We 3. We tore these dresses up. You'd better take them along for evidence." "Oh," the cop said. "Okay. Go on into the wagon, and no funny business, hear me?" They offered no funny business. In the wagon, Ross expounded on his theme that there must be directing intelligences, and that they must be at the top. Helena was horribly depressed because she had never been arrested before, and Bernie was almost jaunty. Something about him suggested that he felt at home in a patrol wagon. It stopped, and the elderly stripe wearer opened the door for them. Ross looked on the busy street for anything resembling a station house and found none. The cop said, "Okay, you people, get along, and let's don't have no trouble or I'll run you in." Ross yelled in outrage, "This is a frame-up. You have no right to turn us loose. We demand to be arrested and tried." "Wise guy," sneered the cop, climbed into the wagon, and drove off. They stood forlornly as the crowd eddied and swirled around them. "There was a plate of sandwiches at that party," Helena recalled wistfully, "and a ladies' room." She began to cry. "If only you hadn't acted so darn superior, Ross. I bet they would have let us have all the sandwiches we wanted." Bernie said unexpectedly, "She's right. Watch me." He buttonholed a pedestrian and said, "Duh." "Yeah?" asked the pedestrian with kindly interest. Bernie concentrated and said, I am losted. I am broke. I losted all my money. Give me some money, mister, please." The pedestrian beamed and said, "That is real tough luck, buddy. If I give you some money, will you send it to me when you get some more? Here's my name wrote on a card." Bernie said, "Sure, mister, I will send the money to you." "Then," said the pedestrian, "I will give you some money because you will send it back to me. Good luck, buddy." Bernie, with quiet pride, showed them a piece of paper that bore the interesting legend, $20. "Let's eat," Ross said, awed. A machine on a restaurant door changed the bill for a surprising heap of coins, and they swaggered in, making beelines for the modest twin doors at the rear of the place. Close up, the doors were not very modest, but after the initial shock, Ross realized that there must be many on this planet who could not read at all. The washroom attendant, for instance, who collected the dimes and unlocked the booths. Dime seemed to be his total vocabulary. By comparison, the machines in the restaurant proper were intelligent. The three of them ate and ate and ate. Only after coffee did they spare a thought for Dr. Sam Jones, who should about then be awakening with a murderous hangover aboard the starship. Thinking about him did not mean they could think of anything to do. "He's in trouble," Bernie said. "We're in trouble. First things first." "What trouble?" asked Helena brightly. "You got $20 by asking for it, and I suppose you can get plenty more. I think we wouldn't have got thrown out of the party if, we hadn't gone swaggering around talking as if we knew everything. Maybe these people here aren't very bright." Ross snorted. Helena went on doggedly, "Not very bright, but they certainly can tell when somebody's brighter than they are. And naturally, they don't like it. Would you like it? It's like a really old person talking to a really young person about nothing but age. But here, when you're bright, you make everybody feel bad every time you open your mouth." "So," Ross said impatiently, "we can go on begging and drifting, but that's not what we're here for. The answer is supposed to be on Earth. Obviously, none of the people we've seen could possibly know anything about genetics. Obviously, they can't keep this machine civilization going without guidance. There must be people of normal intelligence around. In the government is my guess." "No," said Helena, but she wouldn't say why. She just thought not. The inconclusive debate ended with them on the street again. Bernie, who seemed to enjoy it, begged $100. Ross, who didn't, got $11 in singles and a few threats of violence for acting like a wise guy. Helena got no money and 3 indecent proposals before Ross indignantly took her out of circulation. They found a completely automatic hotel at nightfall. Ross tried to inspect Helena's room for comfort and safety, but was turned back at the threshold by a staggering jolt of electricity. "Mechanical house dick," he muttered, picking himself up from the floor. "Well," he said to her sourly, "it's safe. Good night." And later in the gents' room, to Bernie, "You'd think the damn fool machine could be adjusted so that a person with perfectly innocent intentions could visit a lady—" "Sure," said Bernie soothingly. "Sure. Say, Ross, frankly, is this Earth exactly what you expected it to be?" The attendant moved creakily across the floor and said hopefully, "Dime?" End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C. M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Their second day on the bum, they accumulated a great deal of change and crowded into a telephone booth. The plan was to try to locate their starship and find out what, if anything, could be done for Sam Jones. An automatic central conferred with an automatic information and decided that they wanted the captain of the Port Baltimore rocket field. They got the port captain on the wire, and Ross asked after the starship. The captain asked, "Who wants to know, huh?" Ross realized he had overdone it and shoved Bernie to the phone. Bernie snorted and goggled and finally got out that he just wanted to know. The captain warmed up immediately and said, "Oh, sure. The funny-looking ship, it was still there all right." "How about the fella that's in it?" "You mean the funny-looking fella? He went someplace." "He went someplace? What place?" "Someplace. He went away like. I didn't see him go, mister. I got plenty to do without I should watch for every dummy that comes along." "Thanks," said Bernie hopelessly at Ross's signal. They walked the street, deep in thought. Helena sobbed. "Let's leave him here, Ross. I don't like this place." "No." Bernie growled. "What's the difference, Ross? He can get a snootful just as easy here as anywhere else." "No. It isn't the dock, don't you see? But this place is the place we're looking for. All the answers we need are here. We've got to get them." Bernie stepped around 2 tussling men on the ground, ineffectually thumping each other over a chocolate-covered confection. "Yeah," he said shortly. Helena said, "Isn't that a silly way to put up a big sign like that?" Ross looked up. "My God," he said. A gigantic metal sign with the legend, "Buy Smogs, you can smoke them," was being hoisted across the street ahead. The street was nominally closed to traffic by cheerfully inattentive men with red flags. A mobile boom hoist was doing the work, and quite obviously doing it wrong. The angle of the boom arm with the vertical was far too great for stability. The block-long sign was tipping the too-light body of the hoisting engine on its treads. Ross made a flash calculation. When the sign fell, as fall it inevitably would, perhaps 200 people who had wandered uncaringly past the warning flags would be under it. There was a sudden aura of blue light around the engine body. It tipped back to stability. The boom angle decreased and the engine crawled forward to take up the horizontal difference. The blue light went out. Helena choked and coughed and babbled, But Ross, it couldn't have become—" Ross said. It's them. Who? Excitedly. The people behind all this. The people who built the cities and put up the buildings and designed the machines. The people who have the answers. Come on, Bernie. I just seem to antagonize these people. I want you to ask the boom operator what happened. The boom operator cheerfully explained that, nah, it was just something that happened. Nah, nobody did nothing to make it happen. It was in case if anything went wrong, like, you know? They retired and regrouped their forces. Foolproof machines, Ross said slowly. And I mean really foolproof. Friends, I was wrong. I admit it. I thought that those buildings and cars were something super special, and they turned out to be just silly gimcracks. But not this blue light thing. That boom had to fall. Bernie shrugged rebelliously. So what? So they've got some kind of machines you don't have on Halsey's planet. A different order of machines, Bernie. Believe me, that blue light was something as far from any safety device I ever heard of as the starships are from ox carts. When we find the people who designed them, suppose they're all dead. Ross winced. He said determinedly, We'll find them. They returned to their begging and were recognized one day by the gray-haired profile of the party. He didn't remember just who they were, or where they were from, or where he had met them, but he enthusiastically invited them to yet another party. He told them he was Henry Matson, owner of an airline. Ross asked about accidents and blue lights. Matson jovially said some of his pilots talked about them things, but he didn't bother his head none. You get these planes from the field, see? And they got all kind of gadgets on them. Come on to the party. They went, because Henry promised them another guest, Sanford Eisner, who was a wealthy aircraft manufacturer. But he didn't bother his head none either. Them rockets was hard to make. You had to feed your patterns, like into the master jigs just so, and boy, if you got 'em in backwards, it was a mess. Where'd you get the patterns? Look, mister, we always had the patterns, and don't spoil the party, will you? The party was a smasher. They all woke with headaches on Matson's deep living room rug. You did fine, Ross, Helena softly assured him. Nobody would have guessed you were any smarter than anybody else here. There wasn't a bit of trouble. Ross seemed to have a hiatus in his memory. The importance of the hiatus faded as time passed. There was a general move toward the automatic dispensing bar. It seemed to be regulated by a time clock. No matter what you dialed first thing in the morning, it ruthlessly poured a double rye with Worcestershire and Tabasco and plopped a fair imitation of a raw egg into the concoction. It helped. Along about noon, something clicked in the bar's innards. Guests, long since surfeited with the prairie oysters, joyfully dialed martinis and Manhattans, and the day's serious drinking began. Ross fuzzily tried to trace the bar's supply. There were nickel pipes that led heaven knew where, some vast depot of fermentation tanks and stills, fed grain and cane by crawling harvest monsters. Grain and cane planted from seed the harvest monsters carefully culled from the crop for the plow and drag and drill and fertilize and cultivate monsters. His head was beginning to ache again. A jovial martini drinker who had something to do with a bank, roared, "Hey, fellas, I got an idea what we can do. Let's go on over to my place." So they all went, and that disposed of another day. It blended into a dream of irresponsible childhood. When your clothes grew shabby, you helped yourself to something that fit from your host of the moment's wardrobe. When you grew tired of one host, you switched to another. They seldom remembered you from day to day, and they never asked questions. Their sex was uninhibited, and most of the women were more or less pregnant most of the time. They fought and sulked and made up and giggled and drank and ate and slept. All of the men had jobs, and all of them, once in a while, would remember and stagger over to a phone and make a call to an automatic receptionist to find out if everything was going all right with their jobs. It always was. They loved their children and tolerated anything from them except shrewd inquisitiveness, which drew a fast bust in the teeth from the most indulgent daddy or adoring mommy. They loved their friends and their guests as long as they weren't wise guys, and tolerated anything from them as long as they weren't wise guys. Did it last a day, a week, a month? Ross didn't know. The only things that were really bothering Ross were, first, nobody wouldn't tell him nothing about the blue lights, and second, that Bernie, he was acting like a wise guy. There came a morning when it ended as it had begun, on somebody's living room rug with a headache pounding between his eyes. Helena was sobbing softly, and that wise guy Bernie was tugging at him. "Leave me alone," ordered Captain Ross without opening his eyes. "Wouldn't let a man get his rest. What did he have to bring them along for anyway? Should have left them where he found them, not brought them to this place, Earth, where they could act like a couple of wise guys and keep getting in his way every time he came close to the blue light people, the intelligent people, the people with the answers to... He lay there trying to remember what the question was. "Have to get him out of here," said Helena's voice with a touch of hysteria. "Go back and get that fellow Harland," said Bernie's voice, equally tense. Ross contemplated the fragments of conversation he had caught, ignoring what the two were saying to him. Harland, he thought fuzzily. That wise guy. Bernie had him on his feet. "Let go," ordered Ross, but Bernie was tenacious. He stumbled along and found himself in the men's room of the apartment. The tired-looking attendant appeared from nowhere, and Bernie said something to him. The attendant rummaged in his chest and found something that Bernie put into a fizzy drink. Ross sniffed at it suspiciously. "What is it?" he asked. "Please, Ross, drink it. It'll sober you up. We've got to get out of here. We're going nuts, Helena and me. This has been going on for weeks." "Nope. Gotta find a blue light," Ross said obstinately, swaying. "But you aren't finding it, Ross. You aren't doing anything except get drunk and pass out and wake up and get drunk. Come on, drink the drink." Ross impatiently dashed it to the floor. Bernie sighed. "All right, Ross," he said wearily. "Helena can run the ship. We're taking off." "Go ahead." "Goodbye, Ross. We're going back to Halsey's planet where you came from. Maybe Harlan can tell us what to do." "Go ahead. That wise guy," Ross sneered. The attendant was watching dubiously as Bernie slammed out and Ross peered at himself in a mirror. "Dime?" the attendant asked in his tired voice. Ross gave him one and went back to the party. Somehow it was not much fun. He shuffled back to the bar. The Boilermaker didn't taste too good. He set it down and glowered around the room. The party was back in swing already. Helena and Bernie were nowhere in sight. Let them go, then. He drank, but only when he reminded himself to. The party had become a costume ball. One of the men lurched out of the room and staggered back, guffawing. "Look at him!" one of the women shrieked. "He got a woman's hat on. Horace, you get the craziest kind of ideas." Ross glowered. He suddenly realized that while he wasn't exactly sober, he wasn't drunk either. Those soreheads, they had to go and spoil the party. He began abruptly to get less drunk yet. Back to Halsey's planet, they said? Ask Harlan what to do, they said? Leave him here? He was cold sober. He found a telephone. The automatic central checked the automatic information and got him the captain of the Port Baltimore rocket field. The captain was helpful and sympathetic, caught by the tense note in Ross's voice when he told him who wanted to know. The captain said, "Gee, buddy, if I'd have known, I would have stopped them. Stole your ship, is that what they done? They could get arrested for that. You could call the cops and maybe they could do something." Ross didn't bother to explain. He hung up. The party was no fun at all. He left it. Ross walked along the street, hating himself. He couldn't hate Helena and Bernie. They had done the right thing. It had been his fault all the way down the line. He'd been acting like a silly child. He had a job of work to do, and he let himself be sidetracked by a crazy round of drinking and parties. Of course, he told himself, something had been accomplished. Somebody had built the machines. Not the happy morons he had been playing with. Somebody had invented whatever it was that flared with blue light and repaired the idiot errors the morons made. Somebody, somewhere. Where? Well, he had some information, all negative. At the parties had been soldiers and politicians and industrialists and clergy and entertainers and, heaven save the mark, scientists. And none of them had had the wit to do more than push the number 3 button when the green light blinked, by rote. None of them could have given him the answer to the question that threatened to end human domination over the cosmos. None of them would have known what the words meant. Maybe, Ross made himself face it, maybe there was no answer. Maybe even if he found the intellects that lurked beneath the surface on this ancient planet, they could not or would not tell him what he wanted to know. Maybe the intellects didn't exist. Maybe he was all wrong in all his assumptions. Maybe he was wasting his time. But, he told himself wryly, he had fixed it for himself that time was all he had left. He might as well waste it. He might as well go right on looking. A migrant party was staggering down the street toward him, a score of persons going from one host's home to another. He crossed to avoid them. They were singing drunkenly. Ross looked at them with the distaste of the recently reformed. One of the voices raised in song caught his ear. Bobbed his nose and dyed it rose and kissed his lady fair and sat her down on a cushion brown in a 7-legged chair. By Jones, he said, my shoes are red and so's my overcoat, and with buttons 9 in a zigzag line I'll— Doc! Ross bellowed. Doc Jones! For God's sake, come over here. They got rid of the rest of Dr. Sam Jones's party, and Ross sobered the doctor up in an all-night restaurant. It wasn't hard. The doctor had had plenty of practice. Ross filled him in, carefully explaining why Bernie and Helena had left him. Doc Jones filled Ross in. He didn't have much to tell. He had come to in the ship, waited around until he got hungry, fallen into a conversation with a rocket pilot on the field, and that was how his round of parties had begun. Like Ross, Doc, in his soberer moments, had come to the conclusion that Earth was run by person or persons unseen. He had learned little that Ross hadn't found out or deduced. The blue lights had bothered him, too. He'd asked a pilot about it, and found out about what Ross had. There appeared to be some sort of built-in safety device which kept the inevitable accidents from becoming unduly fatal. How they worked, he didn't know, but he had an idea. "It sounds a little ridiculous, I admit," he said, embarrassed, "but I think it might work. It's a radio program." "A radio program?" I said it sounded ridiculous. "They call it 'What's Biting You?' and one of the fellows was telling me about it. It seems that you can appear before the panel on the program with any sort of problem, any sort at all, and they guarantee to solve it for you. There's some sort of bond posted. I don't know much about the details, but this man assured me that the bond was only a formality. They never failed." "Of course," Doc finished, hearing his own proposal with a touch of doubt, "I don't know whether they ever had any problem like this before, but—" "Yeah," said Ross, "what have we got to lose?" They got into the program. It took the techniques of a doubler on an army chow line and a fair amount of brute strength, but they got to the head of the queue at the studio and wedged themselves inside. Doc came close to throttling the man who prowled through the studio audience, selecting the lucky few who would get on stage, but they got on. The theme music swelled majestically around them, and a chorus crooned, "What's biting you, huh?" It was repeated 3 times, with crashing cymbals under the huh. Ross listened to the beginning of the program and cursed himself for being persuaded into such a hair-brained tactic. But he had to admit the program offered the only possibility in sight. The central figure was a huge, jovially grinning figure of papier-mâché, smoking a smog and billowing smoke rings at the audience. An announcer, for some obscure reason in blackface, interviewed the disturbed derelicts who came before Smiley Smog, the papier-mâché figure, and propounded their problems to Smiley in a sort of doggerel, and in doggerel the answers came back. The first person to go up before Smiley was a woman, clearly in her last month of pregnancy. The announcer introduced her to the audience and begged for a real loud holler of hello for this poor, miserable little girl. "All right, honey," he said, "you just step right up here and let old Uncle Smiley take care of your troubles for you. Let's go now. What's biting you?" She sobbed. "It's like I'm gonna have a baby." "How'd you like that?" the announcer screamed. "She's gonna have a baby! What do you say to that, folks?" The audience shrieked hysterically. "All right, honey," the announcer said. "So you're gonna have a baby, so what's biting you about that?" "It's my husband," the woman sniffled. "He don't like kids. We got 8 already," she explained. "Jack, he says if we have one more kid, he's gonna take off and marry somebody else." "He's gonna marry somebody else," the announcer howled. "How'd you like that, folks?" There was a tempest of boos. "All right now," the announcer said. "You just sit there, honey, while I tell old Uncle Smiley about this. You ready? Listen. What's biting this lady is plain to see. Her husband don't want no more family." The huge figure's head rotated on a concealed hinge to look down on the woman. From a squawk box deep in Smiley's papier-mâché belly, a weary voice declaimed, "If one more baby is your husband's dread, cross him up, lady, have twins instead." The audience roared its approval. The announcer asked anxiously, "You get it? When you get into the hospital, like, you just tell the nurse you want to take 2 kids home with you, see?" The grateful woman staggered away. Ross gave Doc a poisonous look. "What else is there to do?" the doctor hissed. "All right, perhaps this won't work out, but let's try." He half rose and staggered against the man next to him, who was already starting toward the announcer. "Go on, Ross," Doc hissed venomously, blocking off the other man. Ross went. What else was there to do? "What's biting me?" he said belligerently before the announcer could put him through the preliminaries, is simply this. L sub t equals L sub 0 e to the minus t over 2n. Dead silence in the studio. The announcer quavered. What was that again, buddy? I said, Ross repeated firmly, L sub t equals L sub 0 e to the... Now wait a minute, buddy, the announcer ordered. We never had no stuff like that on this program before. What are you, some kind of wise guy? There might have been violence. The conditions were right for it. But Uncle Smiley Smog saved the day. The papier-mâché figure puffed a blinding series of smoke rings at Ross. From its molded torso, the weary voice said, If you're looking for counsel sagacious and wise, the price is 10 cents. It's right under your eyes. They left the studio in a storm of animosity. Maybe we could have collected the forfeit, Doc said hopefully. Maybe we could have collected some lumps, Ross growled. Got any more ideas? The doctor sipped his coffee. No, he admitted. I wonder... No, I don't suppose that means anything. That jingle? Sure it means something, Doc. It means I should have had my head examined for letting you talk me into that performance. The doctor said rebelliously, Maybe I'm wrong, Ross, but I don't see that you've had any ideas that panned out much better. Ross got up. All right, he admitted. I'm sorry if I gave you a hard time. It's all this coffee and all the liquor underneath it. I swear if I ever get back to a civilized planet, I'm going on a solid diet for a month. They headed for the room marked Gents. Ross sullenly quiet, Doc thoughtfully quiet. Doc said reflectively, The price is 10 cents. Ross, could that mean a paper that we could buy on a newsstand, maybe? Yeah, Ross said in irritation. Look, Doc, don't give it another thought. There must be some way to straighten this thing out. I'll think of it. Let's just make believe that your whole asinine radio program never happened. The attendant materialized and offered Ross a towel. Dime? He said wearily. Ross fished absently in his pocket. The thing that bothers me, Doc, he said, is that I know there are intelligent people somewhere around. I even know what they're doing, I bet. They're doing exactly what I tried to do, acted as stupid as anybody else, or stupider, I'd make a guess, he said, warming up, that if we could just make a statistical analysis of the whole planet and find the absolute stupidest seeming people of the lot, we'd... He ran out of breath all at once. His eyes bulged. He looked at the men's room attendant and at the 10-cent piece in his own hand. You, he breathed. The attendant's face suddenly seemed to come to life. In a voice that was abruptly richer and deeper than before, the man said, Yes, you had to find us yourself, you know. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C. M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. There was a home base, a gigantic island called Australia, to which they took Ross and Doc Jones in a little car that sprouted no wings and flashed no rockets, but flew. They lived underground there, invisible to goggling passengers and crewmen aboard the rockets. They weren't rockets, they were turbojets, but it made the children happy to think that they had rockets, so iron filings were added to the hot jet stream and they sparkled in magnificent display. There they were born, and there they spent strange childhoods, learning such things as psychodynamics and teleportation. By the time they were 8 months or so old, they thought it amusing to converse of self and the meaning of meaning. By 18 months, a dozen infants would chat in terza rima, but by the age of 2 they had put such toys behind them with a sigh of pleasant regret. They would revert to them only for such purposes as love-making or choral funeral addresses. They were then of an age to begin their work. They were born there and trained there for terrible tasks, and they died there at whatever risk. For that they would not surrender their right to die among their own. But their lives, between cradle and grave, those they gave away. Nursemaids, what else can one call them? They explained it patiently to Ross and the doctor. The pattern emerged clearly in the 20th century. Swarming slums abrawl with children, children, children everywhere. Walk down a Chicago South Side street and walk away with the dazed impression that all the world was pregnant. Walk through pretty, pleasant Evanston and find the impression wrong. Those who lived in Evanston were reasonable people. They waited and thought. Being reasonable, they saved and planned. Being reasonable, they resorted to gadgets or chemicals or continents. A woman of the period had some 390 opportunities to conceive a child. In the slums and the hills, they took advantage of as many of them as they might. But around the universities, in the neighborhoods of the well-educated and the well-to-do, what was the score? First, education until the age of 20. This left 299 opportunities. Then, for perhaps 5 years, shared work. The car, the mortgage, the furniture, that 2 salaries would pay off earlier than 1. 234 opportunities were left. Some of them were seized. A spate of childbearing perhaps would come next. But subtract a good 10 years more at the end of the cycle for the years when a child would be simply too late. Too late for fashion, too late for companionship with the firstborn. We started with 390 opportunities. We have perhaps 144 left. Is that the roster complete? No. There is the battle of the budget. No, not right now. Not until the summer place is paid for. And more. The visits from the mother-in-law, the quarterly tax payments, the country club liaisons, and the furtive knives behind the brownstone fronts, and what becomes of fertility, they have all been charted. But these are superfluous. The ratio 390 to 144 points out the inevitable. As 390 outweighs 144, so the genes of the slovenly and heedless outweigh the thoughtful and slow to act. We tampered with the inevitable. The planet teemed and burst. The starships went forth. The strong, bright, quick ones went out in the ships. 2 sorts were left. The strong ones who were not bright, the bright ones who were not strong. We are the prisoners of the planet. We cannot leave. The children, the witless ones outside, can leave, but who would have them? Ross peered into the shifting shadows. But, he said, you are the masters of the planet. Masters? We are slaves, fully alive only here where we are born and die. Abstracted and as witless as they when we are among them, well we might be. For each of us square miles to stand guard over. Our minds roving across the traps we dare not ignore, ready to leap out and straighten these children's toppling walls of blocks, ready to warn the child that sharp things cut and hot things burn. The blue lights, did you think they were machines? They were us. You're torturing yourselves, Ross exploded. Let them die. Let 10 billion children die? We are not such monsters. Ross was humbled before their tragedy. Diffidently, he spoke of Halsey's planet, Reagan's world, Azor, Jones. He warmed to the task and was growing, he thought, eloquent when their smiles left him standing ashamed. "I don't understand," he said, almost weeping. The voice corrected him. "You do. But you do not yet know what to do. Consider the facts. Your planet, sterile and slowly dying. The planets you have seen, one sterile because it is imprisoned by ancients, one sterile under an end-driven matriarchal custom, one sterile because all traces of divergence have been wiped out. Earth, split into an incurable dichotomy, the sterility of brainless health, the sterility of sick intellect. Humanity, then, imprisoned in 1,000 sterile tubes, cut off each from the other, dying. We feared war, and so we isolated the members with a wall of time. We have found something worse to fear. What if the walls are cracked?" "Crack the walls? How? Is it too late?" Somehow the image of Helena was before him. "Is it too late?" they gently mocked. "Surely you know. How? Perhaps you will ask her." The image of Helena was blushing. Ross's heart leaped. As simple as that? For you, yes. For others, there will be lives spent over the lathes and milling machines, eyes gone blind in calculating and refining trajectories, daring ones lost screaming in the hearts of stars, or gibbering with hunger and pain as the final madness closes down on them, stranded between galaxies. There will be martyrs to undergo the worst martyrdom of all, which is to say, they will never know of it. They will be unhappy traders and stock chasers, grinding their lives to smooth, dull blanks against the wearying routine so that the daring ones may go forth to the stars. But for you, you have seen the answer. Old blood runs thin. Thin blood runs cold. Cold blood dies. Let the walls crack. There was a murmuring in the shadows that Ross could not hear. Then the voice again, saying a sort of goodbye. "We have had a great deal of experience with children, so we know that they must not be told too much. There is nothing more you need be told. You will go back now." Ross dared interrupt. "But our ship, the others have taken it away." Again the soundless laughter. "The ship has not been taken far. Did you think we would leave you stranded here?" Ross peered hard into the shadows, but only the shadows were there, and he and Jones were in the shadows no longer. "Ross!" Helena was hysterical with joy. Even Bernie was stammering and shaking his head incredulously. "Ross, dearest, we thought... And the ship acted all funny, and then it landed here, and there just wasn't anybody around, and I couldn't make it go again." "It will go now," Ross promised. It did. They sealed ship. He took the controls, and they hung in space, looking back on a blue-green planet with a single moon. There were questions, but Ross put an end to questions. He said, "We're going back to Halsey's planet. Harlan wanted an answer. We found it. We'll bring it to him. The FTL families have kept their secret too well. No wars between the planets, but stagnation worse than wars. And Harlan's answer is this. He will be the first of the FTL traders. He'll build FTL ships, and he'll carelessly let their secrets be stolen. We'll bridge the galaxy with FTL transports, and we'll pack the ships with a galaxy of crews. New genes for old, hybrid vigor for dreary decay. Do you see it?" His voice was ringing loud. Helena's eyes on him were adoring. Mate Jones to Azor, Halsey's planet to Earth. Smash the smooth declining curve. Cross the strains and then breed them back. Let mankind become genetically wild again instead of rabbits isolated in their sterile hutches. Exultantly, he set up the combinations for Halsey's planet on the Wesley board. Helena was beside him, proud and close as he threw in the drive. End of chapter 14. End of Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth. This book recorded by Phil Chenevert, June of 2016.